me introduce our first speaker. It's Professor Barry Mazur from Harvard University, and he will tell us about thoughts on Ogg's torsion conjecture.
Hello? Yeah. Should I share my screen again, or is
Yes.
it? Okay. Let me do that. Hold on. Okay. This is. I don't. Okay, let me try it and see whether this works. How's that?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, great. Okay, yes, I'm so, I mean, I'm in first great joy for us being able to thank Andrew Ogg for so many things. And adding to that, of course, the Frank and Florence fellowship that he has endowed the Institute. I too have had some wonderful memories at the Institute. And it's also marvelous to see. I saw on the screen before I put my slide on it, the names of so many old friends, and it's just wonderful to be at least virtually together with them. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit now. Can everyone see the entire screen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, maybe I can't, so I'm going to deal with that. Okay. Well, no. I'll do something. Okay, anyway. Yeah. His mathematical viewpoint has really inspired so many things, and his results and conjectures has been such a gift to us all, and to me personally also. Oops. Here's one tiny instance of the many times I was indebted to Ogg for his marvelous, joyful way of thinking. And Tate and I recorded this in one of our papers. We wrote Ogg Passed Through Our Town and mentioned that he had discovered, and this is what he said, a point of order 19 on the Jacobian of x1 of 13. And he allowed, therefore, us to feel that the Jacobian was not entitled to have more than 19 points. This was the beginning of his celebrated torsion conjecture. It's going to relate to modular curves, as David Nirenberg said, and it can be paraphrased as saying that the rational points on certain modular curves that parametrize torsion points on elliptic curves, they exist if and only if there's a good geometric reason for them to exist. And that's what my talk is going to be about. Take a look at the footnote. It's thanks to various people for conversations that I had about these slides that I'm going to present. And I want to say that there are going to be footnotes, and I'm not going to read them, and you shouldn't read them here, but they will be hints at further references, things I'm going to talk about, and the slides and notes are going to be on my webpage in a few days. So you can refer to them if you're interested in going in whatever direction the references lead you to. So here's an overview of what we're going to talk about. You have the Galois group of a number field being a field of finite degree over Q. Now that Galois group is sort of a mathematical object, and the wonderful question that has permeated modern number theory is to study the arithmetic of elliptic curves in and the abelian varieties in the context of these Galois groups. For example, you can ask the question of classifying pairs consisting in an abelian variety and an embedding. So A would be a polarized abelian variety defined over a number field, K, and an embedding of a finite abelian group with GK action into the algebraic points of the abelian variety, that embedding being respecting the GK action on this finite group and on the algebraic points of the abelian variety. Now, here are the three basic parameters that are very interesting to consider in terms of uniformity, and you have a choice of how to range each of them. For example, you could allow the finite abelian groups to run through, say, all cyclic finite groups with arbitrary GK action, and A to run through all abelian varieties with a specific type of polarization. And it's sort of equivalent to asking for a classification of K-rational cyclic isogenies of abelian varieties. What you do is you take the finite group in the abelian variety, divide by it, you have a map from the abelian variety to a quotient, and that's the isogeny. So with a little abuse of language, one sometimes refers to these cyclic finite groups contained in the algebraic group of algebraic points of an abelian variety as isogenies, because they produce isogenies, and from such isogenies you can produce them. Or you could also restrict to those finite abelian groups with trivial GK action, and then you're asking for K-rational torsion points, let's say points of that are not of infinite order on abelian varieties. It might also vary over a class of number fields. For example, number fields of a fixed degree D over a number field K. And we'll be talking a lot about the degree 2, that is, say, quadratic points. And the reason for this is there's been an amazing amount of very recent work in the past 2 years, let me say pandemic years, and yet there's an incredible amount of work in understanding uniform issues regarding these quadratic points. You could fix the dimension of the varieties you're considering, and in fact, we'll only be talking here about elliptic curves, but in the wings, there are also abelian surfaces to be considered. Now here's a page of what I'll call a footnote. As I said, there are an extraordinary amount of recent progress regarding the classification of quadratic points. Here are some references, and there'll be more references in the notes that I will post. These references are specifically making use of a very powerful new mode of finding rational points on curves and on varieties of various sorts. It's called the quadratic Chabot-Kim method. And although they've been used to study quadratic points, the adjective quadratic in the quadratic Chabot method and the adjective quadratic and quadratic points have almost nothing to do with one another. But one of the main methods that are used in what I'll be talking about is quadratic Chabot-Kim. Okay, going back to the background, we want to geometrize the problem of studying isogenies or torsion points. And if you organize your parameters appropriately, you can do that by recasting the problem. What are the 2 torsion points or 3 torsion points of an elliptic curve in a abelian variety by finding k-rational points on a specific algebraic variety. In more technical terms, you frame representable problem, and the algebraic variety in question is called the moduli space representing that moduli problem. And there are classical examples, which I think almost everyone, I think, in the room knows. There is the modular curve y1 of n that classifies elliptic curves endowed with a torsion point of order n. There is y0 of n that classifies elliptic curves endowed with a cyclic subgroup of order n, not necessarily the subgroup isn't necessarily rational over the field in the base field. And these curves are not complete, but they're completed in a very beautiful way to produce smooth projective curves that are usually called x1 of n and x0 of n. And the way you complete it is by adding a finite set of points, the cusps. So this is what I just said. The elliptic curves possessing a k-rational point of order n are classified by the k-rational points of this affine curve y of n, y1 of n, and x1 of n is the smooth completion of it by a junction of cusps. And similarly, classification of elliptic curves defined over K possessing a K-rational cyclic isogeny of degree n is given by the K-rational points of the affine curve y0 of n, and x0 of n is the corresponding smooth projective completion. Okay, now when you do this, you get a lot of side benefits. So for example, if the curve x0 of n is of genus 0, and you note that one of those cusps is defined over Q, this is not only a curve of genus 0, but it has a over Q, but a rational point over Q. It's isomorphic to the projective line over Q, so it follows there's a rational parameterization of that curve, which gives us a systematic account. And this is for any number field or for any field, if you want, of a k-rational parameterization of cyclic n isogenies of elliptic curves for any k. If it's of genus greater than 0, you don't have that, but you do have a q-rational embedding of the curve x0 of n into its Jacobian, which is an abelian variety. And that allows us to relate questions about cyclic n isogenies to questions about the Diophantine structure of this abelian varieties. For example, the Mordell-Weil group, that is, say, the group of k-rational points of that abelian variety. Now, besides being able to apply all these resources of Diophantine techniques, there are simple constructions that help you. For example, if you have such a moduli space, where the k rational points actually provide a classification of your problem over k, then I'm going to take primes, but I could do a similar thing for all numbers. For any prime p, you can consider the set of k rational points of the algebraic varieties. That's the p symmetric power of m. Let us say m p times, and you divide by the symmetric group SP. And that is, well, it's an algebraic variety of some dimension. It's an algebraic divided, but it classifies the same problem ranging over all extensions of k of degree p. That is to say, if you know the k rational points of this guy, you also know the k rational points in a uniform way, the k rational points of the rational points of your moduli space, but ranging over all extensions of the base field k of degree p. So here's an illustration of this, considering cyclic isogenies of degree n. It turns out that if you take the p symmetric power of x0 of n, you can map it, of course, to the Jacobian of x0 of n, and you do it by just taking this p-tuple of points and just make a divisor, which is the sum of that p-tuple, so, the sum of all of the elements in that p-tuple, and you make it of degree 0 by subtracting p times infinity. And you get an embedding, actually, of this in there. That is, say, if n is sufficiently large. And that's a theorem. That's an interesting theorem. But what that does is it certainly tells you that the question of find uniformly all, say, isogenies of degree n over all fields of degree p over a base field k is somehow related to finding the k rational points of the Sabine variety. Now, well, I said somehow, it's in fact better than somehow, is geometrically related to the Mordell-Weil group of the Jacobian of x0 of n, at least if n is sufficiently large. For example, when the prime p is 2, there is a very general theorem of Faltings which generalizes Mordell's conjecture, and I'll discuss this in a bit. We have this sort of picture. Here's the symmetric square of x0 of n. x0 of n is supposed to be classifying isogenies of degree n, cyclic isogenies of degree n of elliptic curves. And we have mapping of the symmetric square of x0 of n to j0 of n, as I described. But what Faltings does is he gives you a rather striking description for any number field k of the structure of the k rational points in this surface as follows. That surface may or may not contain a single curve of genus 0. If it does, then x0 of n is hyperelliptic. You can prove that that map from x0 of n to this curve, the natural map, is degree. And if x0 of n is hyperelliptic, there is such a curve, otherwise not. There may also be a bunch of elliptic curves, curves of genus 1 in the symmetric square. there could be one or a few, finitely many, such that all of the k-rational points of the this surface lie either in this curve of genus 0 or these elliptic curves, except for finitely many. And those finitely many, one might call isolated points. So that's the structure of the geometry of the Diophantine analysis of this surface. And it's also, therefore, the geometry of the Diophantine analysis of the question, the uniform question, what can you say about n isogenies over arbitrary quadratic fields over Q or over any given base? Now, Andrew's torsion conjectures, as I say, taken in broad terms here, I say, can be formulated in terms of the geometrization, and I put it in plural because there are two geometrizations going on as described. First, you could talk about, if you're interested in Q rational points, you can talk about the Q rational points of these modular curves, but you can also talk about the Mordell-Weil groups of the beam varieties, that is, say, of their Jacobians. And he has two conjectures, which have so influenced the subject that we are still sort of deeply involved in it and deeply indebted to him for that. Conjecture 1 is an isomorphism class of finite groups occurs as a torsion subgroup of Mordell-Weil group of some elliptic curve defined over Q, if and only if the modular curve that classifies this problem is of genus 0. Now, we know that the moduli problem, if the modular curve that classifies the problem as genus 0, not only is there going to be one elliptic curve with a cyclic subgroup rational over Q corresponding to C, but there'll be infinitely many because it will be parametrized by the parameter of that genus 0 curve. Now I have a footnote here, and the footnote is just that if you, there's a form of that conjecture made by Beppo-Levy, just a form, and Beppo-Levy, and I don't ask you to read this, it's going to be in my notes if you want, or you can go to Norbert Schapfeler's and René Schuff's paper on it. So it's a century old, and he also was interested in torsion points, but he didn't call them torsion points. He kept thinking of, you take a point and you keep multiplying it by 2, by 3, by 4, by 5, by 6. And if it comes back and loops back to be trivial, he calls those points failures. So as far as Beppo-Levy is concerned, a torsion point in an elliptic curve is a failure. Anyway, he has his ideas about the nature of failures, and that connects in some way to Andrew's conjecture. And put it another way, an isomorphism class occurs if and only if it is expected to occur. That is, say, it necessarily occurs as a consequence of the ambient geometry. And this idea, which is at the heart of Andrew's conjectures in this area, is a continuing guiding inspiration for number theory. And ambient geometry means, for the most part, the algebraic geometry of various curves, for example, the curve x1 of n. Now, here's an example of that, not Well, it's an example of that conjecture, but it's also an example of the essential insight behind the conjecture. Andrew has an article called Rational Points of Finite Order on Elliptic Curves, and he focuses, or he considers, at least in great detail, the curious case of X037. X037 has two non-cuspal Q rational points. Now, how do you explain them? Are they explainable by geometry or not? The answer is yes, because they're images of the hyperelliptic involution. That is, say, X037 is hyperelliptic, and so therefore there's an involution. And that involution is curiously non-modular, has no modular interpretation. And so when you apply the involution to two cusps, it maps those cusps to 2 points that are not cusps, that is, say, two rational points, that is, say, two examples of cyclic 37 isogenies. Of course, they're related examples. And then he writes, as Mazur and I are inclining to the opinion that Y0 of n has no Q rational points except for a finite number of values of n, we are certainly interested in knowing when this sort of thing is going on and putting a stop to it, if at all possible. Okay, that's conjecture one. Now, there's a conjecture on the other, on another level. They're deeply connected, and one conjecture helps the other. The conjecture on the other level has to do with torsion points of the Jacobian of X0 of n. So we'll let J0 of n be the Jacobian of X0 of n. And since it's a theorem of Monin-Grunfeld that the cusps of X0 of n map to torsion points of J0 of n, and they're a natural map that sends infinity to the origin J0 of n. We'll let C0 of n be the group generated by those cusps. So C0 of n is sitting in the torsion subgroup of the Mordell-Weil group of n. So now we have seemingly quite a different type of conjecture. The cusps generate the torsion, at least when n is prime. That's what Andrew conjectured. When n is prime, the cusps generate the torsion. Put it another way, at least when n is prime, there are no unexpected Q rational torsion points in J0 of n. They all come from cusps. Now, as I said, these two conjectures are interlinked by a long story, which I will not get into, but the consequences of it are that you get a really, really marvelous classification of various objects. For example, if you let Cn denote the cyclic group of order n, you get a complete list of possible isomorphism classes of finite groups that occur as torsion subgroups of the Mordell-Weil group of rational curves, and this is the list. Cyclic of order n for n less than or equal to 10, and then a few other examples. Okay. Now, even better, all these torsion groups occur infinitely often over Q, since the corresponding modular curves are all genus zero curves possessing a rational point. That is to say, not only the conjecture, but the spirit of Andrew's way of thinking about these things prevail. Now, that being true, it inspires much more general uniform boundedness conjectures for rational points. For example, conjectures that the order of the torsion group of an abelian variety over a number field can be bounded in terms of the dimension of the variety in the number field. And there are stronger ones, that the torsion is bounded in terms of the dimension of the variety and the degree of the number field. These are utterly open questions. They're so open that one would never try to solve them in any generality, but one certainly would do well to consider really interesting special cases of it. And also, it's striking how few additional isomorphism classes of k-rational torsion subgroups of elliptic curves can occur in elliptic curves over quadratic and cubic number fields. And now we're getting to the quadratic and cubic points that I hinted we wanted to move towards. So here it is over quadratic number fields. It's the theorem of Mimosa, Kenku, and Kamieni. You have only, you let K range through all quadratic number fields and E, all elliptic curves over those fields, and ask, what are the torsion subgroups of the Mordell-Weil group over K of all those E's over all those K's? And the answer is, they're isomorphic to one of 26 groups. Now, in fact, a good deal of these groups are already occur over Q. So what's so strange is the passage from Q to all quadratic fields doesn't produce that many more examples. Now you might think, well, maybe cubics are different, but no. Here's a much more recent theorem. Due to Martin Derek, due to Derek's Polsky, Van Hoy, and Morrow, and Zurich Brown, like I range through all cubic number fields, the torsion groups of in the Mordell-Weil groups of elliptic curves, any elliptic curve over any of those fields is again isomorphic to one of the following 26 groups. They're slightly different groups, but it's still just 26 of them. The last one is interesting. Well, they're all interesting. But the thing is, there are infinitely many Q isomorphism classes for all those torsion subgroups, except for the cyclic group of order 21. And in that case, there's just one curve that has it, and the curve is well known. It's a rather beautiful example of a curve just standing there, glaring at you, as being unique in terms of a basic property. And of course, it defines as well a cubic field, a rather natural cubic field in this case, but the curve itself is subtle. Now, since that conjecture too about the cuspidal group generating all torsion in the Jacobian of x0 of n, you might try to expand that where n is prime. You might try to expand that to a larger class of n's. For example, for square free n's, and that was taken care of by Kubert, Lang, and Takagi. And in the case where n is square free, the set of cusps are Q rational. But when the set of cusps themselves are not Q rational, you get much more subtle issues involved. So in the more general context, you might do this. You might restrict to the Q rational points of this group generated by the cusps, and conjecture that the Q rational torsion subgroup of J0 of n is equal to that. I mean, that's the only natural thing to conjecture here. If you want to know what the torsion in J0 of n looks like over Q. And one is beginning to get sort of very serious results along those lines by Oda in a certain context. He proved that at least the p primary parts are equal for p greater than or equal to 5. And as I write here, just last week, the PNAS article entitled "Another Look at Rational Torsion of Modular Jacobians" by Ken and Preston, who are both out at the talk, so they can comment on their theorem, and they generalized it significantly. So, I mean, you may as well try to follow in the spirit of Andrew Ogg and conjecture further. Okay, so you let x, you can let x over q be any modular curve of any of the natural modular curves, say x0 of n or x1 of n, and you let j be the Jacobian of that x, and then you could have C be the finite, well, étale subgroup, because it won't be defined over Q. There'll be a Galois action on C over Q contained in J. And now you could ask, what's the relationship between this C and something about torsion in that Jacobian? And here's one possibility. Let's let K over Q be the field that's cut out by the action of the Galois group on C. So there certainly is an exact sequence that that looks like this. That is, say, Galois acts on the automorphism group of the algebraic points of C, and it has a kernel, and the kernel is given by the Galois group of that field that cuts it out. You could define the cuspidal defect of X to be the co-kernel. Okay, and here's a possible conjecture that the cuspidal defect of any of these X's that I list above, well, I only listed x0 of n and x1 of n, but there are other variants too, is trivial. And as I say, in the case of x0 of n, there are recent results of Ribbett and Wake and Rem that's directly related to this. So there's the fact that when you go to quadratic fields, you don't get very many more torsion points in elliptic curves than you got when you were over Q. It's a kind of striking uniformity. It tells us that for all but finitely many positive numbers n, the curve x1 of n, which classifies torsion points over Q, is what Carl Rubin and I call Diophantine stable for all quadratic extensions L over Q. So now let me go to Q rational cyclic isogenies. We're back to Q now, not quadratic. We can consider the Q rational isogenies of degree n of elliptic curve defined over Q. And it's been known, thanks to a tradition of work that includes a sequence of papers of Kenku, that these Q rational cyclic isogenies of degree n occur and only occur and do occur in this small list of values of n. And it follows in the spirit of Ogg that all these n isogenies can be given geometric reasons for existing. Even that 37 isogeny, because it does come from a hyperelliptic involution of x0 of 37. So what about uniformity results regarding cyclic n isogenies of elliptic curves ranging over all quadratic fields? Well, we're back to the picture of sim2 of x now. And there are expected, if you want, and unexpected L rational cyclic isogenies for L ranging through them, and I've described them. It could be in the case where x0 of n is of genus is a hyperelliptic. There'll be a bunch of quadratic points on this curve of genus 0. If it's not hyperelliptic, this doesn't exist. But if it's bielliptic, there'll be possibly some points on these curves, and otherwise there'll be only finitely many isolated quadratic points. There are a few other expected points, namely when they're expected, they're given by a CM elliptic curves for where related to quadratic imaginary fields of class number 1. And so for over these quadratic imaginary fields, you have the existence of quite a number of expected isolated points. That is to say, if E is an elliptic curve over Q, that's CM with over the field K with CM field K, then just by the nature of the action of Galois on a complex multiplication curve, you'll get a load of cyclic isogenies. And so therefore, you might want to think of them as expected and throw them out. I want to here also mention some recent results on a very, very interesting modular curve. Neither x0 of n nor x1 of n. It's something that classifies elliptic curves where Galois acts relative to a certain prime as acts where the image is a split carton, and that curve curiously has only CM points, therefore only a finite number that can be completely listed. The curve that they studied very specifically is the curve, modular curve of level 13, it being the one curve having to do with a split carton level structure that was particularly difficult. Anyway, all CM points are expected. So you can find sporadic quadratic points to be a point on x0 of n if it has to be isolated, not a cusp, and not the inverse image of a Q rational point in P1 in the hyperelliptic case, not the inverse image of a rational point on an elliptic curve in the bielliptic case, and it's not a point of x0 of n classifying a CM elliptic curve. And the conjecture is ranging over all x0 of n's for n, there are only finitely many sporadic quadratic points. continuing the quotation I gave of Andrew's view regarding rational torsion, I'm guessing that you and I would certainly be interested in knowing when this sporadic quadratic points question sort of thing is, when it goes on, and in putting a stop to it if at all possible. There's an extraordinary amount of recent work about sporadic points, and I'll try to go through it rather rapidly. Sheldon Kamieni sort of repeated Andrew's attitude towards the issue of explaining sporadic points in this quotation. And here is a scorecard of things that have been accomplished for hyperelliptic x0 of n's and bielliptic x0 of n's. So there's a theorem of Ogg that gives the 19 values of n for which x0 of n is hyperelliptic. And I've boxed them, some of them, if they're also bielliptic. Now, all of those sporadic quadratic points have been computed. All of them have been computed by Bruin and Neumann, and the case of x0 of 37 is taken care of by Joshua Box, who also computed some of the others. And Francis Barr computed the values of n for which x0 of n is of genus greater than 1 and bielliptic. And until very recently, there remained a dozen entries in that table for which we didn't know the set of their isolated quadratic points. But now, thanks to, I mean, within pandemic times, let me say, Philip Neumann and Borna Vukorepa have shown that have computed all the isolated quadratic points for all bielliptic curves, x0 of n, and we also know them for all hyperelliptic curves. There are other types of points, exotic points. The exotic points are ones where you divide by the involution defined by Acton and later to get a quotient of x0 of n, x0 of n mapping to x0 of n by of degree 2. And you get a double cover. And you can ask for the points that are not cusps, not CM, and come from this quotient. And that's defined in a recent article. And for all anyone knows, these are the only known exotic anisogenies. Okay. Of course, there's also recent exciting work about uniform bounds for fields of degree greater than 3. But it's 3 o'clock. And thanks to Andrew for his inspiration, to the people involved in all this recent work, and to you for listening.
Thank you, Barry. We have a tight schedule, but I think we have time for a quick question. Okay, if no questions. Oh, sorry, I have someone up.
Yeah.
So I have a question. Just one second. Hi, Barry. Great talk. The gonality bounds, you know, these gonality bounds for x naught n, they probably allow you to get quite far with getting rid of many n's, which have low gonality, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah,
Those are used, that kind of generalizes Ogg's theorem about.
absolutely. Gonality bounds are absolutely essential, in fact, yeah. Right. Right, of course. But you know, when we talk about hyperelliptic or bielliptic, that gonality, even, you know, and yeah.
Your question over there?
I would like to ask if there's a framework for sporadic points or if nature is unkind.
You're gonna ask that?
Yeah,
Who's asking that?
it's John Duncan.
Who?
John Duncan.
Ah, okay. So you're asking Sheldon Kamiani's question.
I'm
Yeah.
asking for your opinion on it.
What's curious is that people have tried hard, especially in the exotic. There are 5 exotic examples after all. So you can, you know, you can hold them in your hand, and you can ask, why does this one exist? Why does that one exist? And the one that I think has taken the imagination of the people working in the field most is the one where n is 311. And I think people are close to finding an answer for that one. But I mean, even if you do that, you have 4 more among the exotic points. Why do they exist? But what's amazing is it turns out not to be an isolated question. I mean, you could ask, why do the Q rational torsion points and cyclic isogenies, why did they exist? Well, we know now, Q. But you can now ask a more general, ask this within a more general frame. And first, it's intriguing. There are sometimes real answers. And then there are almost answers. So I mean, it's a thing.
All right, let's thank Barry again.